the West has been secretly underdeveloping Africa, and then has the audacity and the gall to say that Africans are poor and Africa is a poor continent. What up guys, I am Sa Ra Garvey. You better like, you better share, you better comment, you better subscribe, because today we are talking about Arinkana Chimhimbori Quo. I bet you can't say that. She is a former advisor of the African Union, and she has recently been fired for some of her comments that she made about the West. Now, what exactly did she say? She, with her research and working closely with the African continent, has come to the conclusion that the West, namely France, has been sabotaging certain countries in Africa. But how have France been sabotaging Africa? Let's get into it.
So you believe that France is still trying to silence you? Do you believe that?
Let me put it this way. Maybe I lasted longer than I probably would have based on my views on France. And it's not even my view. It's basically stating the facts in terms of what France is doing to Africa.
What they're currently doing?
What they're currently doing and have been doing for decades since the quote-unquote independence of the former French colonies, yes.
So what is happening? Because look, the reality is a lot of Americans are not necessarily hearing about what's happening in African nations. 7 of the top 10 fastest growing economies come from Africa, but you also have a significant impact of the Chinese in many African countries as well. And so do you believe that the government of France still has a lot of control over a number of African nations of their former colonies?
They have significant control over all of their former colonies, specifically 14 of them. Just to give you the highlights of what they did when they were giving the independence, so to speak, to their former colonies, they forced them to sign a document which they are calling the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. You have to understand, on one hand, they are saying we're giving you independence, which turned out to be mostly political independence, but that you also have to sign this document, which is titled the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization.
The Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. That is something that these African countries had to sign. Now, if colonization has stopped and if African countries have been given their independence, why would now they have to sign a pact called the Colonization of Africa? I thought they were free.
How has that negatively impacted those African countries?
It has impacted them terribly, terribly, terribly. If you look at it, you give up your, the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization said those countries were expected to deposit 85% of their bank reserves back then with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. And should those countries wish to request some of those monies, because remember they were only left with 15% of their reserves, then they would have to submit a financial statement for the country, and if approved, they could only access up to 20% of whatever they had deposited the year before as a loan at commercial interest rates. The only difference now is the 85% deposits have now been lowered down to maybe between 50 and 60%. But the countries are still forced and required to deposit their bank reserves with the French Central Bank.
So let's break that down into a real world scenario. You have a paycheck and your paycheck is $5,000 per month. What is happening is they are taking 80% of your paycheck, leaving you with 20%. And then saying, if you want to access the other 80% of your own paycheck, you have to borrow that at a rate of interest. No one who works for themselves would actually sign an agreement like that, knowing that this money is their own. So what it essentially does is keep African nations poor and keep them in debt to Western nations from borrowing their own money.
So picture this situation. You are depositing all your monies with France. Should you need some of your money, you get it as a loan at commercial interest rates. So immediately you have a credit with France, but you begin to owe France. This has been going on and continues to this day. So combined, the 14 countries are giving to France cash, cold hard cash, over $500 billion every year. And France takes that money and invests it in its own stock market under the French name, and the countries may or may not know the returns. Currently, for every 14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it in the French stock market, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion. So you do the math to see how much money France is taking out of Africa every year. And yet France has the audacity to then look at African countries and call them poor countries. Why would poor African countries give $500 billion to France year in and year out? What really gets me the most is, how does the world sit back and watch this carnage take place in Africa? Where is the United Nations? This is the body that's supposed to be looking out for any violations of human rights. It is my humble opinion that singularly, what France is doing to Africa is the biggest violation of human rights.
Human rights. We hear about this all the time. The West speaks about human rights, and there is a human rights organization, and they say this country is violating the human rights of its people, its trans people, its gay people, its children, its women. However, the West is clearly showing here that they don't really care about human rights of other countries. What they care about is money, and money is king and queen of the world, it seems. Because when it comes to taking money out of Africans' pockets and violating the human rights of the people of certain African countries, the West is as silent as a church mouse. It does not care about the human rights of these African people that they are taking the money from. Now, how is colonization stopped? How is colonization over when the West or Western countries continue this? And this is only one Western country she's talking about. She's talking about France specifically. What about the rest of the Western countries?
Women and children are dying of starvation, youth unemployment, when the same poor countries are giving $500 billion to France. It simply does not make any sense. And I don't know how the world can sit back and watch all this unfold and nobody is saying anything. It's unacceptable. It is wrong. And we're simply asking France to do what is right, what is just, and what is fair with the Africans.
I attended the event that took place at the embassy here, and we actually ran your speech where you gave the history of what took place and how modern-day Africa was carved up. For the folks who don't know, explain the Berlin Conference.
The Berlin Conference was our colonizers' way of seeing to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. They came together in Berlin at the invitation of the then Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, to divide up Africa.
1891, what was
November 1884 to February of 1885.
Got it.
They met and chopped up Africa into the tiny little economies that we see today.
She's not wrong. For those who do not know their history, let's take a trip down history lane and understand exactly what the Berlin Conference was all about. In 1884, the leaders of 14 European countries and the United States came together to discuss control of Africa's resources. Known as the Berlin Conference, they sought to discuss the partitioning of Africa, establishing rules to amicably divide resources among the Western countries at the expense of the African people. Of these 14 nations at the Berlin Conference, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Portugal were the major players. Notably missing were any representatives of Africa. One of the tasks of this conference was for each European country that claimed possession over a part of Africa to bring civilization in the form of Christianity as well as trade. King Leopold II of Belgium promised just that the Congo was formally recognized as Leopold's personal possession, extraordinarily rich in natural resources, including ivory, palm oil, timber, and rubber. Leopold would seek to increase his personal wealth at the expense of the environment and the people of the Congo. The West has a history with colonization, the denigrating of the people, and the disrespect of both the resources and the people. But that was supposed to be a historical account. It wasn't supposed to be a modern account. However, according to the former African Union representative, this is still going on.
I want to show, so give our folks a sense of Africa before the Berlin Conference and afterwards, because when I look at this map, what I see is I don't see as many countries as we see today. So we see Henry, go to my iPad, please. So this is a map of Africa before the Berlin Conference.
Correct. So what we were prior to the Berlin Conference, we were massive, powerful kingdoms. Kingdoms with well-established religious and educational systems. Kingdoms that preceded the Greek civilization, the Roman Empire. If the truth be told, civilization began in Africa. Have you ever wondered why? When they talk about Greek philosophers, the mathematicians, they were sent to Egypt for training, to Egypt for advancement. It's because Africa already had it. The pyramids, the Zimbabwe ruins, they were there over 2,500 years before the Greek civilization, 2,500 years before the Roman Empire. It all started in Africa. That's part of the history that was cut out, and they set out to get us to forget that life as we know it began in Africa. Civilization as we know it began in Africa. The Europeans stole it from us.
Now, many of you may be saying, oh, she's now emotional. What she's saying now is that she's being a reverse racist. She's not making any sense. However, if we take a trip down memory lane, we will find that what she's saying is actually true. What we're going to do is that we are going to read from a book called Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James. And this is what he had to say about what she had to say. The immigration of Greeks to Egypt for the purpose of their education began as a result of the Persian invasion 525 BC and continued until the Greeks gained possession of that land and access to the royal library. Through the conquest of Alexander the Great, Alexandria was coveted into a Greek city, a center of research and the capital of the newly created Greek Empire under the Ptolemies' rule. A center of research and the capital of the newly created Greek Empire under the Ptolemies. Egyptian culture survived and flourished under the name and control of the Greeks until the edicts of Theodosius in the 4th century AD and that of Justinian of the 6th century AD, which closed the mystery temples and schools, as elsewhere mentioned. Concerning the fact that Egypt was the greatest education center of the ancient world, which was also visited by the Greeks, reference must again be made to Plato and Timaeus, who tells us that Greek aspirants of wisdom visited Egypt for initiation, and that the priests of Sais used to refer to them as the children in the mysteries. As regards the visit of Greek students to Egypt for the purpose of their education, the following are mentioned simply to establish the fact that Egypt was regarded as the educational center of the ancient world, and just like the Jews, the Greeks also visited Egypt and received their education. It is said that during the reigns of Amasis, Thales, who is said to have been born around 585 BC, visited Egypt and was initiated by the Egyptian priests into the mystery system and science of the Egyptians. We are also told that during the residence in Egypt, He learned astronomy, land surveying, mensuration, engineering, and Egyptian theology.
So that partitioning of Africa back in 1884 and those partitionings remain in place today is responsible for a lot of what has happened in Africa. Our inability to grow our economies, our inability to travel from one country to the other. You look at tourism. If you need to go to Africa and visit 3 different countries, you got to send your passport to DC 3 different times. And each time your passport comes back, you got to send it again to another country, 2, 3, 4 weeks before you get your passport back. And then you got to send it back to Washington. At times, those embassies are on the same street. You could have walked from one embassy to the other, but you can't do it. And by the time you get your passport back with the 3rd visa, the visa for the first country is expired. Who needs to go through all that? So you say, forget it, I'm not going to Africa, I'm going to Europe. At every level, what we see happening today in Africa that affects economic development is directly related to what was done in 1884.
So in conclusion, the West is consistently and constantly underdeveloping Africa, while acting as if they are the pinnacle of civilization and the pinnacle of human rights. They are going into countries and they are disrespecting the people. They are denigrating the people. And they are keeping Africans as essentially babies and poor. This has been Sa Ra Garvey. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Until the next time, I'm gonna catch you on the flip side.